And I look forward to that day being with you as that happens. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yields back. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2013, the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, is recognized for 60 minutes as a designee of the Minority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members be given 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks.
That objection so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I stand before you today proudly co-anchoring along with the distinguished gentleman from the Silver State, my good friend, Representative Horsford, co-anchoring the CBC special order, what we've termed throughout the year our hour of power, where for 60 minutes we have an opportunity to speak directly to the American people about issues of great significance that affect the folks back home in our congressional districts and in many instances impact the entire nation. Today, we've gathered here to look back at the issues that members of the CBC have tackled individually and collectively throughout the year on behalf of the American people. But we look back in order to look forward as we anticipate the challenges that we confront in the next year on a whole variety of issues. Now, throughout the year, we've come to the floor every Monday that we have been in session to address a great many issues of significance to the American people. We came to the floor to deal with comprehensive immigration reform in early February. And then we addressed the need to preserve Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act during the week in which the Supreme Court was holding oral argument. We confronted the challenges in and around sequestration, presented the CBC People's Budget, which sets forth a more progressive way forward in order to deal with the economic challenges that we confront in this country. We addressed health care disparities, the student loan crisis, poverty and income inequality in America, entrepreneurship. We had the opportunity to reflect and celebrate the life and the legacy of a former distinguished member of this august body, Representative Bill Gray from the great state of Pennsylvania. We reviewed economic security through the labor movement, stood up, of course, for the Affordable Care Act, addressed the debt ceiling and the need not to hold the American economy hostage. We confronted hunger in America and the absolute moral imperative to stop the more than $39 billion in cuts that our friends on the other side of the aisle would like to make to the SNAP program. These are the issues that throughout this year we've taken to the floor of the House of Representatives to talk directly to the American people about the issues that we are working on their behalf. And today, I'm pleased that so many distinguished members of the CBC have come to join us, including the distinguished chairperson who has led us admirably with great courage and intelligence and clarity throughout the entire year. And I'm now pleased to be able to yield to the distinguished gentle lady from Ohio, the chairperson of the Congressional Black Caucus, Representative Marsha Fudge.
Thank you so very much. Thank you, Congressman Jeffries, for yielding, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank my colleagues, Congressman Jeffries and Horsford, for leading this CBC Special Order Hour and for leading 16 CBC Special Order Hours this year. It has been a pleasure to listen to you both. The information that you have shared with the American public is to be commended, and I thank you both. Because week after week, you have led the CBC in discussions that promote increased opportunity, justice, and a better America for all Americans. I ask my colleagues to join me in saluting you both for bringing our message to the American people. Mr. Speaker, 2013 has been a challenging year. Partisan gridlock has made this year one of the least productive in the history of the U.S. Congress. To date, Congress has passed only 52 bills into law. And if you remove the ceremonial legislation, that number shrinks to 42, almost matching the 41 laws passed in 2011, which was to date the least productive year in the history of the Congress. It is far too easy to simply point fingers. But this much is clear. Congress is failing the American people. Partisan grandstanding has paralyzed our legislative branch, leaving our country unable to move forward to prepare for a rapidly changing and uncertain world. Facing widespread economic and political instability, America looks to Congress for leadership. The CBC has risen to this challenge, working with both sides of the aisle and both chambers of Congress. This year, the CBC addressed the government shutdown, our federal budget process, gun violence, voting rights, justice reform, education reform, and so much more. The members of the CBC also led efforts to directly engage underserved communities on behalf of the Affordable Care Act, to improve the judicial nomination and confirmation process, discussing the pressing issues related to immigration reform, especially for those of the African diaspora. And we convened a summit on the culture of violence in our communities. I am proud of the CBC for our bipartisan solution-oriented approach to the most pressing issues facing our country. And despite the tough legislative environment, the CBC consistently looks to build coalitions and enact solutions that will benefit all Americans. Unfortunately, a deep divided Congress has prevented America from reaping the benefits of our efforts. As we move into next year, Congress must end our crisis-oriented budget cycle. Our inability to end the sequester, to move past the failed policy of austerity and generate new sources of revenue, which will slow economic growth and leave all but the very wealthy behind. We are a great nation, but we cannot sustain our standing unless we end the partisan political gamesmanship and live up to the promise of America. Working together, we can create a more prosperous America where the only ceilings to our potential are the limits of our own imagination. Mr. Speaker, in 2 weeks, the first session of the 113th Congress will come to a close. It will be the end of a Congress marked with missed opportunities and hyper-partisan gains. The Congressional Black Caucus is prepared to make 2014 the year Congress moves beyond the partisan politics of years past, end our legislative paralysis, and restore faith in our government and prosperity back to the American people. I yield back.
I thank the distinguished chairperson of the CBC for her thoughtful and eloquent remarks, and certainly for making the point that we as members of the CBC have come to Washington to try and make a difference on behalf of the people that we represent back home and the entire nation. We came to work together to try and find common ground, to promote solutions for the American people in the face of the difficult challenges that we've confronted. We didn't come to deal with a government shutdown that cost the economy $24 billion in lost economic productivity and this constant obsession with the Affordable Care Act and the consistent effort to delay, defund, or destroy the opportunity to give tens of millions of otherwise uninsured Americans access to health care. And so hopefully, as the first session of the 113th Congress winds to a close and we move toward the opportunity to get some things done next year, we can find our way toward a more productive second half of the 113th Congress. I'm pleased that we have been joined by the distinguished architect of the Congressional Black Caucus budget, as well as a member of the Judiciary Committee who's worked hard on issues of social and economic justice, and he's here today to share with the American people The work that the CBC has done on putting forth a more progressive, inclusionary budget that works for working families, middle-class Americans, and seniors. I yield now to Representative Bobby Scott from Virginia.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the gentleman from New York and the gentleman from Nevada and the chair from Ohio for their strong work, and particularly for talking about some of the things that the Congressional Black Caucus has accomplished over the last year. I wanted to take the opportunity to highlight the CBC's work on advocating a responsible budget, offering responsible solutions to address the budget deficit, cancel the sequester, and grow the economy. Last March, we offered our budget for fiscal year 2014 as an alternative to the budget that was adopted by the House. The CBC budget makes tough choices, but not at the expense of our most vulnerable communities. The CBC budget offers a concrete plan that both cancels the economically disastrous sequester and then pays for that cancellation. Our budget is able to do so while also protecting Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP nutrition benefits, and other vital safety net programs that protect millions of Americans from poverty. CBC budget also reduces the nation's budget deficit by approximately $2.8 trillion over the next decade compared to the February baseline calculated by the Congressional Budget Office. Other ideas have been presented in the past to either cancel the sequester or reduce the deficit, but they almost always include significant cuts to Social Security and Medicare. These ideas have included changing the way the Social Security benefits are calculated, the so-called chain CPI, which reduces the cost of living benefits, or raising the age of eligibility for Medicare from 65 to 67. The CBC budget is able to pay for the cancellation of the sequester and reduce the budget deficit without these harmful cuts to Social Security and Medicare. Now, our budget is in stark contrast to the Republican budget that passed the House earlier this year. That budget claimed to reduce the deficit by $4.6 trillion over the next decade by making draconian spending cuts in non-defense discretionary spending and unspecified savings in mandatory spending. That's the category that is mostly comprised of Social Security and Medicare. They're going to get savings, better known as cuts. But that budget also included a $5.7 trillion tax cut that was paid for with an asterisk, meaning that the Ways and Means Committee and the Appropriations Committee would have to figure out how to fill the $5.7 trillion hole. Now, arithmetic requires you to recognize that you can only fill that hole by either raising taxes or an additional cuts. Now, we know that the Republicans are opposed to tax increases, and the only real big-ticket item left that could come anywhere close to filling that hole would be Social Security and Medicare, the only thing left on the table to pay for that. Now, the CBC budget does not include an asterisk or other types of budget gimmicks. Our budget outlines a concrete plan that makes tough choices and presents credible options that can be used to achieve our budget reduction targets. Now, the CBC budget calls for revenue enhancements totaling $2.7 trillion over the next decade. Our budget outlines how the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee can reach this number by highlighting several revenue options totaling $4.2 trillion that could be used to reach the $2.7 trillion revenue target. These revenue options include $1.1 trillion that can be obtained by limiting deductibility of corporate interest payments, $1 trillion by closing special tax breaks and corporate loopholes, over $800 billion by taxing capital gains and dividends as ordinary income, almost $500 billion by having a 5.4 surcharge on that portion of your income over $1 million, over $300 million the speculators tax of 1/4% on Wall Street trades, $200 billion by ending the Bush-era tax cuts on that portion of your income over $250,000, returning to the estate tax exemption that was in existence in 2009, over $100 billion, and over $100 billion by reducing the tax gap through better enforcement of the IRS code. Now, those are specifics. They may be unpopular, but at least they're specific, in stark contrast to go find $5.7 trillion unspecified that the Republican budget included. Now, the revenue enhancements provided in the CBC budget would allow Congress to totally cancel the sequester and then pass a jobs package of at least $500 billion. At $50,000 each, that's over 10 million jobs that could be created in 1 year with a jobs bill of that magnitude, almost enough to hire everybody drawing unemployment today. To provide an additional $300 billion in long-term investments in our economy through education, job training, health care, and advanced science and research. And as I said earlier, the reforms contained in the CBC budget would reduce the deficit $2.8 trillion over the next decade compared to CBO's baseline. That would put our nation on a strong, sustainable path, all without jeopardizing programs that support our seniors and programs that educate the next generation of leaders in business, science, and technology. And as we move forward to 2014 and the next budget deadline, the Congressional Black Caucus will continue to advocate these priorities contained in our budget. It is imperative that Congress pass a budget that expands economic opportunity, invests in the American people, and reduces our deficit. The CBC budget presents a concrete plan backed by actual numbers, not by asterisks, that shows how we can reduce our deficit while not being required to make further cuts in vital programs that support our nation's safety net, especially Social Security and Medicare. Most importantly, the CBC budget presents a clear path towards both economic prosperity and fiscal responsibility for our nation. And I want to thank the CBC budget for the opportunity to work on this budget, because it is a responsible budget, does the right thing, and it has specifics that you can actually look at, in stark contrast to the asterisks, gimmicks, and other assumptions that cannot be fulfilled without going into Social Security and Medicare that the Republican budget has. So I yield back to the gentleman from New York.
I want to thank the distinguished gentleman from Virginia for his very thoughtful exposition and explanation about the CBC budget, and the fact that there really are two different visions that have been set forth when comparing the CBC budget and the Republican budget. The CBC budget, of course, is designed to promote progress for the many. The budget presented by the House majority is designed to promote, in our view, prosperity for the few. The CBC budget creates a balanced approach to deficit reduction that invests in the economy, protects important social safety net programs like Social Security and Medicare. The House GOP budget balances itself on the backs of working families, the poor, the most vulnerable Americans in our society, and that, I believe, is the wrong approach to take as it relates to the well-being of the American people. And so I thank the distinguished gentleman for his thoughts and his work on that progressive document that the CBC has put forth. It's now my honor to yield to our distinguished co-anchor for the CBC special order, who has been with us throughout the year, anchoring, articulating, putting forth the CBC vision on a vast array of issues important to our districts and to the American people. And today, I believe he is going to speak to us about the work that he has led in partnership with other members of the CBC and folks on our side of the aisle for a fair, racially inclusive, and equitable America. And so let me yield to my good friend, Representative Stephen Horsford.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to my good friend from the state of New York. One of the great pleasures of being a member of this body is getting to know colleagues from across the state, and we have a dynamic freshman class, 5 members who are freshmen in the Congressional Black Caucus, and it has been my honor to co-anchor this hour of the special order for the Congressional Black Caucus with my esteemed colleague, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries, and I'd like to commend him for his tremendous leadership on a breadth of issues that have come before this Congress, and even recently in his role as a member of the Judiciary Committee, some legislation that we'll be considering just this week is going to happen because this member has worked across the aisle to bring people together to try to seek common ground. And it's what we need more of, Mr. Speaker. You know, one of the things that we're doing here tonight is reflecting after a year in this 113th Congress. And, you know, I'm a new member, and I've been here now, like I said, for just over a year after being elected. And my constituents back home in Nevada ask me often, so what is it like to be a member of Congress? You know, do you feel good about what it is you're able to accomplish? And you know, it is an honor. It's a great honor to serve the people of Nevada's 4th Congressional District here in the People's House, the House of Representatives. And it's a great honor, and I'm proud to be a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, which has colleagues who are some of the most committed proponents of progressive social and progressive economic justice legislation that comes before this Congress. But as honorable as this position is, as proud of a moment that it is for me personally, when I hear the statistics that were read by our chairwoman, Chair Fudge, that less than 50 bills that have been passed by Congress have become law. That's rather frustrating, and it's frustrating to the American public. Prior to coming to Congress, I served in the state legislature in Nevada. We only meet every other year for 4 months. Do you know, Mr. Speaker, in 4 months and 120 days, we considered and passed approximately 1,000 bills? Think about that. One state can consider and approve approximately 1,000 bills in 120 days every other year, but 435 members in the House of Representatives in more than a year have been able to accomplish less than 50 bills becoming law. That's why the American public is so frustrated. And so while I reflect on this year, there is areas that I'm proud of and accomplishments that we have made. But unfortunately, there are bills that have been proposed that have not moved, and legislation that is still pending in this body. And so my hope is that as we reflect on this first year in the 113th Congress, that it will challenge us as members to come prepared in 2014 to get the people's job done. And there are a number of key bills that we need to focus on. And as my colleague has talked about, we have fought to ensure our justice system is more fair and protects all citizens equally under the law. We have fought to increase access to affordable health care, something that is desperately needed for millions upon millions of Americans. Our leaders have worked to fight to preserve and to protect important social safety nets like SNAP benefits and Medicare and Medicaid, because we have made it our mission to protect America's most vulnerable citizens. We have time and time again called for the sequester to be ended. And I just met with constituents in my district in Nevada who said, please, don't allow a government shutdown to happen again in January. Don't allow these cuts under the sequester. The second round of cuts would be even more harmful, let alone the first round to take hold. And so despite these areas, there is work to be done. One of the issues that I've been particularly involved with as members of this Congressional Black Caucus has been immigration reform, the need for comprehensive immigration reform. And I am proud to have served as one of the co-chairs, along with my colleague Mr. Jeffries and Representative Clark, also from New York, as co-chairs of the Congressional Black Caucus's Immigration Reform Task Force. We have worked tirelessly with other House Democrats to craft a bipartisan common sense bill, H.R. 15, which aims to begin fixing our broken immigration system. It would grow our economy, we know, by 5% in just 2 decades, reduce our deficit by hundreds of billions of dollars, create thousands of jobs, and most importantly, Mr. Speaker, it would bring millions of people out of the shadows and into society, including thousands of dreamers, by creating a pathway to citizenship, all the while shoring up our border security. As a member of the Homeland Security Committee, I know my colleague Mr. Jeffries on the Judiciary Committee, we have worked time and time again on legislation to bring forward proposals on comprehensive immigration reform. And so we're asking our colleagues on the other side to join with us to make these things possible, to not just talk about it, to not be proud or pleased with just 50 bills being passed by one of the most least productive Congresses in the history, but to actually accomplish things that the American public expects us to accomplish. Another top priority that I'd like to talk about this evening, Mr. Speaker, that we've been working on with my colleagues in the Congressional Black Caucus is preventing racial profiling practices in our law enforcement that have been hurting individuals across the country. Our citizens deserve to live free from fear, especially among those whose jobs are to serve and to protect. That's why I introduced the Universal Respect Act, a bill that would help prevent racial profiling practices from occurring. The Universal Respect Act will establish an interagency review of federal efforts to eliminate racial profiling in the United States by amending the Homeland Security Act to require that recipients of federal law enforcement grants and training facilities do not engage in racial profiling. Simply put, Mr. Speaker, the Universal Respect Act will end the practice of rewarding law enforcement programs that do not respect basic civil rights and civil liberties. We need to make sure we stay vigilant in our fight for justice in this country, and that has been a constant theme in the Congressional Black Caucus's legislative agenda, whether it's on the budget, as our colleague Mr. Scott just talked about, or a plethora of bills that have been brought forward by individual members. And it's central to the FY14 budget that has been worked on by the Congressional Black Caucus, which reduces the budget and creates millions of jobs in a fair and balanced way. Let me just close by talking about one final area, Mr. Speaker, that we as members of this body need to stay focused on, and that's jobs and growing the economy. In my home state of Nevada, we still have a stubbornly high unemployment rate above the national average. Despite improvements in certain sectors, there's far too many Nevadans who are still looking for work, many who have been out of work for now more than a year, year and a half, going on 2 years. And I know as part of the budget debate that will occur between now and January 15th will be this discussion about extending unemployment benefits, which is incredibly important to American families who have been struggling during this sustained recession. And so I would challenge my colleagues on the other side, allow us to bring forward the number of jobs legislation and bills that would help build our infrastructure back up in this country. Allow us to bring these bills to a vote in this chamber so that we can get our country moving again. We can get the middle-class economy moving. We can help middle-class families who are trying to provide for themselves and their families with good, sustainable, family-sustainable jobs, not low-wage jobs that put people in the same positions to depend on assistance programs by the federal government. That's not what the American public wants. They want a family-sustaining job that allows them to provide for themselves and their family. That is what we are arguing for. It's what the Congressional Black Caucus represents each and every week when we come to this special order hour, and why these issues are incredibly important. And so as we reflect back on this year, this year of missed opportunities, as my colleague from New York just said. It is, in fact, missed opportunities, because we could have done so much more in this body. 435 members, dedicated staff, people who love our country and who want to see it progress. But it's time for us to put the partisanship, the ideological views aside, and to allow us to put our country first. That's what I'm here for, Mr. Speaker. I know it's what my colleagues are here for, and I look forward to working with anyone from either side of the aisle, in either chamber, who wants to work with the President to move our country forward. And I appreciate this special order time, and I would yield back my time at this time.
Thank the distinguished gentleman from the Silver State for his observations and for his look forward as it relates to the issues that we all hope this Congress will decide to tackle as we close out the first half of the 113th Congress and move toward calendar year 2014. This has been a year of lost opportunities, of obstruction, of delay, of distraction, and a failure to meaningfully address the issues of importance to the American people. This has been a very schizophrenic economic recovery. We have come a long way since the collapse of the economy in 2008, but we still have a long way to go. As members of the CBC have consistently pointed out from the floor of the House of Representatives, there are people who have been left behind, and the American people deserve this Congress putting aside issues of partisan bickering and attempting to find common ground to solve their problems. Stock market is way up, corporate profits are way up, productivity of the American people way up, CEO compensation is way up, yet unemployment still remains stubbornly high. There are Americans who have been left behind, but we have not failed to take up a jobs bill from the floor of the House of Representatives at any point this year. As my colleague from Nevada also pointed out, we have a very broken immigration system. There's almost uniform agreement across the aisle about that fact. Yet there's been a failure to bring a meaningful piece of immigration reform legislation to the floor of the House of Representatives, despite the overwhelming demand for action by the American people. Now, we all agree, as the CBC indicated earlier this year, in February, when we took to the floor to talk about the need to address the issue of the broken immigration system, that something needs to be done. And there really are only three possible options. One, we've got mass deportation of the 11 million undocumented individuals who are in this country. That's option number one. Option number two is the status quo. Just leave the broken immigration system in place. Option number three is meaningful, comprehensive immigration reform with a tough but fair pathway towards citizenship. Mass deportation is impractical. The status quo, unacceptable. Comprehensive immigration reform is the right thing to do for this country, for the economy, for the American people. And I'm hopeful, as my colleague from Nevada indicated, that that is the direction that we will go in as we speed to a close this year and attempt to restart the Congress on the other side of the end of the first half of this session. I'm pleased that we have been joined by the distinguished gentlelady from Texas, who is a member of both, distinguished member of both the House Judiciary Committee and the Homeland Security Committee, has worked on many issues as a leader within the Congressional Black Caucus, but as a leader within the Congress on issues of social and economic justice. And it's now my honor and my privilege to yield to her, Representative Sheila Jackson Lee.
me thank the gentleman from New York, and it was thought-provoking to hear the gentleman from Nevada offer his thoughts of bipartisanship, and to listen to the gentleman from Virginia on the astuteness of many issues that have been left along the highway of despair, and also to be joined by our dear friend from New York, who we will hear from shortly, Congresswoman Clark. Let me thank you for the leadership that you've given to this special time, and let me try to work to be succinct in the issues that have been left, again, along the highway of despair very quickly. You started out with immigration reform, and you're kind enough to note that I have served on the Judiciary Committee for a number of years, and formerly the ranking member on the Immigration Subcommittee, now the ranking member on the Border Security and Maritime Committee. I will tell you that there have been many times that we could have come together and passed comprehensive immigration reform, but I'm going to tout as a bipartisan, legitimate expression of border security to share with my colleagues H.R. 1417, which many know was passed out of the Homeland Security House Committee through the efforts of Republicans joined by Democrats, and the legislation passed with no weaknesses, no loopholes, no disrespect for the importance of the security of the northern and southern border. Very strong responses as it relates to operational control, as it relates to the amount of control that we would have at the border, but matching it with the recognition that there must be an infrastructure of immigration reform. But let me throw all those words away and say there must be humanity. There must be concern for human beings, for families torn apart, from dream children destined to be valedictorians and salutatorians, or to be generals in the United States military because this is a country they love. We are losing all that talent. We are losing the talent of those who have trained here with knowledge about the next level of technology because of the no H-1Bs, because we do not have a comprehensive approach. Those folk are leaving, and therefore we're losing the genius that we trained to be able to help us. So I want to join the gentleman and say to him that if there's any cause that we could come together, it would be comprehensive immigration reform. And might I just take note of my button that honors the fast for families, those that have been fasting for almost 20 days, almost a month, because they are trying to pull at the heartstrings of America and the heartstrings of this Congress to recognize that they are Americans too. And they're just a few blocks down the street. Families, children are fasting, asking, is there someone who can hear our plea? So I thank the gentleman for bringing it up, and I want to just make some other points that we've been lingering on and that we have not followed through on. I introduced H.R. 2585, which is a bullying, anti-prevention of bullying and intervention, reflects on where America is when you can find most every child that is interviewed has indicated they have been bullied, or something happens to a child in high school and they will talk about having been bullied some years back, or a child will be shot, or violence will occur, and they'll talk about bullying, even to the extent that it is raised up in the NFL. And I want to pay tribute to a young man, I believe at the Baltimore Ravens, Mr. Race, who has taken this cause up from the NFL. And H.R. 2585 would reauthorize the Juvenile Accountability Block Grant, and it would provide sort of a sentence roadmap that allows organizations that would be funded under the block grant to be able to focus on bullying prevention and intervention. How simple a legislative initiative is that? And I would offer to say that I heard from leadership on both sides of the aisles, why not pass something as simple as that even before Christmas to be able to move forward on something that would not, in fact, be a negative. And I just quickly want to indicate that we have young people exposed to violence in ways that we've not known. 30% of U.S. students in grades 6 through 10 are involved in moderate or frequent bullying. Cases in Florida where young people have been arrested because tragically someone committed suicide. Or the hearing I held in Houston where parents upon parents and students came in to testify how they had been bullied. 1 out of 4 kids is bullied. And some would say, well, they're calling everything bullying. Well, I believe if we do the outreach, we can find a way to develop an infrastructure so that there will be people who will find, one, the comfort of knowing someone cares, a system that intervenes when someone feels something is untoward, and to break the shackles of bullying by getting rid of the atmosphere that is tolerated because it is done in silence and fear. I also introduced a gun safety legislation, and I would hope that someday we can have universal background checks. But as I was driving to the airport, I read an ad in the Houston Chronicle that had gun safes on sale. I said, that guy, I want to give him an award, because my simple legislation requires individuals to store their guns. Have all the guns you want, but have them stored and safe, particularly if you are with a large number of them, and to be able to secure and protect children and those who want to do us harm. One of the things that the CBC worked on that I'm proud that we worked on it, but I will say that it brings me sadness that we're at a point where we've cut $40 billion from the Supplemental Nutrition Program. I went to my food bank and had them explain what a devastating impact that $40 billion, $4 billion a year, will have on the people who are in need in Houston in particular. My city in Houston, the census reports that over the last 12 months, 442,881 incomes were below the poverty level. 18% of households in the state of Texas from 2009 through 2011 ranked second in the highest rate of food insecurity. So why can we not have an ag bill that where we restore the $40 billion? Why are we suggesting that those individuals are deadbeats when 1/2 of the persons on food stamps or SNAP are in fact children? That's something, Mr. Jeffries, that we could come together on and redo, or the conference could redo, and we could look to ensure that we are a place of laws, but a place of humanity. In conclusion, allow me to throw in 2 disparate points, but I consider them justice issues. And that is, first, the Affordable Care Act, which is a justice initiative. It is to say that we all have access to good health care. Now, that is not a carte blanche to good health, because we must change all of our attitudes, do a lot of things to make us healthy, but it certainly is an intervener and allows us to have preventative care, allows women to not be characterized as a pre-existing disease because they're pregnant. It allows children born with pre-existing diseases not to be eliminated from the insurance rolls. And it allows 13 million of Americans receive $1.1 billion in rebates already from the health insurance companies last year when the Affordable Care Act was in place. 105 million Americans have free preventative services. So all of the talk of the technology takes away from the core value that Americans should have access to health care. And today I'm glad to hear that we're making strides in a technological system that is not always perfect. But let us not undermine this bill. And I'm very glad that the Congressional Black Caucus under the leadership of our chairwoman has been strong in educating our constituents about the Affordable Care Act. In conclusion, a remaining challenge that we have. The Voting Rights Act must be reauthorized to the extent of the provision that was eliminated by the Supreme Court decision wrongly, the Shelby County case versus Holder, that took away the provisions of preclearance, which in fact provided justice and the right to vote for all Americans. And so we're gathered, hopefully in a bipartisan manner, the leadership of Mr. Sensenbrenner and others who are on various committees in the Congressional Black Caucus, and the leadership of our Democratic caucus and the Republican Conference, to come together in a bipartisan manner to be able to accept the constitutional premise best said by the Declaration of Independence: we all are created equal with certain inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we have coddled the right to vote. We have welcomed the right to vote. Reading a story about our Puerto Rican citizens who are in Puerto Rico and don't have the right to vote, and how they felt as second-class citizens. Whether those of us on the mainland that have had obstacles thrown in our roadblocks thrown across the pathway that needed to be protected not only by the Bill of Rights, but by the Voting Rights Act that has withstood the test of time, that has been reviewed. And so it is important that we get a construct that all of us can support, so that if there is a voter ID law, it does not block people from voting. It does not keep one particular group from getting a voter ID law because they do not have access, like in Texas, to the Department of Public Safety. Or in essence, that the Voting Rights Act is one that reaffirms America's commitment that every person has a right to vote, one person, one vote. So I want to thank the Congressional Black Caucus for being a leader on so many issues, from gun violence, preventing it, to the issue of dealing with our children and anti-bullying and intervention, to the idea of the Affordable Care Act, to restoring SNAP funding, to the Voting Rights Act, and yes, to a comprehensive approach to immigration reform, particularly the idea that we worked on so extensively, and that is diversity visas. And when I go home and speak to people from all walks of life, particularly the African community, they understand the work that the Congressional Black Caucus has done, the Haitians, those from the Caribbean, those from South Asia, reuniting families. They understand that we have been a leader on the broad landscape of comprehensive immigration reform. For that reason, I'm hoping that we will not end this session by looking sadly back on what we have not done, but that we'll roll up our sleeves. And before we leave here for the end of this particular first session of the 113th Congress, we'll have the opportunity to see an ag bill that will have restored a portion thereof of the SNAP dollars, helping those who cannot help themselves. We will actually have passed a anti-bullying legislation that should draw Republicans and Democrats, that we will have confronted the issue of comprehensive immigration reform, listened to the voices of reason, and passed the legislation in regular order, and then as well that we'll find it within ourselves, in conclusion, that we eliminate the sequester in a way that provides funding back to the basic responsibilities of this government in rebuilding infrastructure, in creating jobs, stopping the bleeding of losing jobs because we have kept a sequester long overdue, funding our defense, providing for education and the safety and security of our seniors and our veterans. Let's get to work. I thank you to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries, for reminding us that we came here to roll up our sleeves and to work for the American people. I yield back.
Thank the distinguished gentlelady from Texas for her leadership on a wide variety of issues important to the social and economic justice landscape, and of course for laying out a very significant roadmap, a blueprint for the future in terms of what this Congress should confront as we close out this first session of the 113th Congress and move toward the second session. We're pleased that we've also been joined by my neighbor back home in Brooklyn, the distinguished gentle lady from the 9th Congressional District, a woman who is one of the CBC co-chairs on the task force related to comprehensive immigration reform. She's been a leader on that issue as she has on many others. She's a member of the Small Business Committee as well as the Homeland Security Committee, represents one of the most diverse districts anywhere in this nation, and has made us all proud to call her colleague. I yield now to Congresswoman Yvette Clarke.
Mr. Speaker, first I'd like to thank the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries, and the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, for their leadership in anchoring this year's CBC Special Order Hour, and thank them in particular for this evening Year in Review. Mr. Speaker, it's been a long road from fighting to keep SNAP funding to rehashing the Affordable Care Act to advocating for immigration reform that is truly diverse and comprehensive, and the CBC has come a long way. As one of the co-chairs of the CBC Immigration Task Force, I'm proud of the work we've done to ensure that everyone, including immigrants of the African diaspora and African Americans, were adequately included and represented in this conversation. It feels like it was just yesterday when we stood here in February introducing the CBC's perspective on the urgent need for comprehensive immigration reform. That night, we laid the foundation of what was to be an uphill battle between politics, policy, and procedure. The CBC, along with our Tri-Caucus colleagues, argued that the burden of the broken immigration system does not encumber one group of immigrants alone. For example, there are approximately 3 million immigrants from the African diaspora in the United States, the vast majority of whom entered the country with legal documentation. But there are millions more from all over the world, including Eastern Europe and Southern Asia. As the conversation increased, the CBC Immigration Task Force tried to highlight the impact of immigrants of the African diaspora from the continent of Africa, the Caribbean region, and South and Central America, which has been large in scale. Their contribution had not been mentioned in the mainstream stories representing reform. Many did not recognize nor understand that the road for many immigrants of the diaspora was significantly different than the proverbial stories in the media. Many entered our nation with legal student visas, like my own parents did, to pursue careers in medicine, science, education, and other professions. Many are proud business owners of law firms, restaurants, grocery stores, shipping companies, and hair braiding venues. There are those who have come as asylum seekers, fleeing the tumult of war, famine, and genocide. And like any other immigrant group, they come to the United States to be productive, tax-paying members of our civil society, to attain the American dream. And like the other immigrant groups, immigrants of the African diaspora are dealing with the backlogged immigration processing, families being ripped apart, falling out of status because they've aged out of the legal immigration process, racial and status discrimination, unfair criminal aggravated felony laws that prohibit judicial review, deportation processes that violate civil and human rights, and an insecure prohibitive student visa program, limited access to work permits, and much, much more. Mr. Speaker, it is imperative for us to acknowledge the fact that many immigrants arrive on our shores during a time of their lives when they are most productive, the most productive years of their lives. Any delay in processing these individuals, bringing them to the fore, would deny us as a nation the opportunity to access their talent, their skill, and abilities in the prime of their lives. Additionally, it was important for us to note that that African Americans, those descendants of the transatlantic slave trade, whom I fondly call longtime stakeholders of this nation, have been affected by our broken immigration system as well. Working class Americans of all backgrounds, races, and ethnicities are adversely affected with a broken immigration system. They're dealing with depressed wages because of unscrupulous, illegal corporate hiring practices. Urban communities are being adequately, thank you, I feel like,
one of the things that the CBC has attempted to work on, as my distinguished colleague from New York has indicated, is to deal with comprehensive immigration reform in a manner that fixes a broken system for all involved. And we certainly are thankful for the distinguished gentlelady's work as a member, a leader of the CBC Task Force on Immigration Reform. we both proudly represent districts that are incredibly diverse. Back at home in the 8th Congressional District in Brooklyn and parts of Queens, I represent African Americans, Caribbean Americans, South Asians, Russian-speaking Eastern European Jewish immigrants, Latinos, Chinese Americans, the gorgeous mosaic of the American people. And what I found, and this has been the history and the experience, in fact, in New York City, is that immigrants are hardworking, entrepreneurial, spiritual, family-oriented, community-centered individuals. And America will be strengthened, of course, by fixing our broken immigration system. Let me now yield back to my distinguished colleague from New York.
Let me thank the gentleman from New York for saving me. I've recovered now and would just like to bring forth a few more points. Working-class Americans of all backgrounds, races, and ethnicities are adversely affected with a broken immigration system. As we stated, they are dealing with depressed wages because of unscrupulous and illegal corporate hiring practices. Urban communities aren't even being adequately counted via the census and other surveys, resulting in the reduction of adequate government services and federal resources to meet the needs of actual populations in our communities, increasing the strain on current public services. Urban communities are exposed to more crime as the undocumented are more reluctant to report crimes, and African Americans are dealing with increased racial and status discrimination, as many are subjected to interrogations based on citizenship. Imagine our delight, Mr. Speaker, when the immigration reform debate gained some traction this year with the actions taking place in the Senate. There were tangible legislative fixes in the works. The CBC quickly expressed our concerns to both the House and Senate leadership over the elimination of diversity visas used largely by African and Eastern European immigrants. We voiced our concern over the ability of American children, particularly those from underrepresented and underserved areas, to be successful in STEM fields without the proper education, especially since much of the emphasis in the debate relied on increasing incentives of migrants in those fields. We also expressed the need to address our immigration judicial system. The current state is not aligned with our criminal justice system, leaving many immigrants forced to experience double jeopardy for nonviolent crimes. We stood up against racial profiling language that does not include religion or national origin, and expressed concerns over the switch from family-based immigration to an economic-based system. Now, as the House looks to different vehicles to consider comprehensive immigration reform, I implore the House leadership to understand the importance of diversity. That is, racial, ethnic, religious, national, and especially economic diversity. The visa equity that must be afforded immigrants from around the globe. If we eliminate country caps without including other avenues for smaller countries, we are jeopardizing the beautiful mosaic that makes this country unique and great. Excuse me. We must elevate consideration of the SAFE Act, which is a bad idea and a slap in the face to our immigrant history. Additionally, we have to have an honest conversation about the relationship between legalization and border security. Allowing those who are here a pathway to citizenship, but creating an obstacle course based in fear to obtain the citizenship is not the way to go. We will never realize the true potential of this country if anyone in our society is held back from realizing their individual dreams. And relying heavily on an economic-based immigration system will exclude many immigrants, creating yet another stratified immigration system, forcing people back into the shadows. That is why, as we look at the next session of the 113th Congress, I ask my colleagues to take the opportunity to revisit these proposals, sans political pressure, sans the haste to get it done, and take a real look at how we can improve the lives of all Americans and all those who strive with the hope to be an American. Mr. Speaker, we must get this right. Our national security is at stake. Our moral standing in the world depends upon it. The American people, many of whom are first- and second-generation immigrants, have demanded it. If we turn our backs on those law-abiding contributors to our civil society that come to our shores only to embrace the American dream, to labor in the rebuilding of our great nation, strengthen our economy, and to serve honorably in our military, we turn our back on ourselves and our future. I can definitely say that the CBC Immigration Task Force looks forward to continuing this conversation into the new year, ensuring that any comprehensive immigration reform measures mirrors the diversity of this nation. So I want to thank my colleague, the gentleman from New York, whose district is right next to mine in Brooklyn, for yielding time to me today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the distinguished gentlelady from New York for her leadership on this issue, for the progress that has already been made, and her continued commitment. The CBC, as I close, Mr. Speaker, will